Good evening and welcome to the regular meeting of the Livonia Board of Education for February 27th, 2023, and I will ask Mrs. Bonnefield to take the roll.
Mrs. Acosta.
Here.
Mrs. Bradford.
Here.
Mrs. Burton.
Here.
Mr. Centers.
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Here.
Mrs. Bonnefield is here. President Johnson.
Here. We have a quorum. Thank you. And Mrs. Jarvis, would you help us in the pledge, please?
With pleasure. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Once again, I want to welcome everyone to our regular meeting. For those of you who are in the audience, and if you want to follow along with our agenda, you can step out to the door on the left, and if you turn to the right, we have both agendas and blue slips for anyone who wants to address us during audience communication. As I said, this is our regular or voting meeting. This is where we take up the issues that have been discussed probably 2 or more times before this meeting. And if you really want to delve into the nuts and bolts of any of the issues that come before the board, I would invite you to watch our Committee of the Whole meetings. You can also go to our website where you can find our agendas for tonight, and that is at livoniapublicschools.org. Highlight over the board tab, and you'll be able to find our agenda. You will also be able to find all of our Committee of the Whole meetings on video. That's important because a lot of times people look at our meetings and say, well, you have a lot of 7-0 votes. It makes it easy because the items that we have where we may have differences are worked out in the Committee of the Whole, where we will come to a consensus that we can all live with. It makes it a lot easier for us to do it that way, and it makes our regular meetings run a little bit smoother. There may be some items that you'll hear a little more context tonight, but generally speaking, those items are more in-depthly discussed at the Committee of the Whole, so I invite you to watch those. The other thing that we always talk about, and it's part of our community with character, and that is respect. This board doesn't always agree on the items, but we respect each other's positions, we discuss things, and we work them out. We think that respecting each other is a great way to teach our kids how to act and how to treat one another. It's very important for us to do that, and we guarantee that we will treat everyone who comes before this board with respect, and all we ask in return is that anybody who addresses the board treats us with respect as well. With that, I think we can go ahead and start, and we'll go to item 3, which is our communications, and we have item A, Principals Week Resolution. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Acosta, welcome back.
Thank you. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolution establishing the week of February 27th, 2023 as Principals Week in Livonia Public Schools.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And good evening, Mrs. Jenkins. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Happy to be here tonight. Wishing you all a very good evening. Tonight we would like to take a few moments to recognize a special group of staff members here in Livonia Public Schools. Our dedicated principals continue to amaze us with their passion, their compassion, their creativity, and their obvious love for education and for our schools. Our principals take the lead in their school communities. They set the tone for our students and staff. They provide guidance, leadership, and they show their professionalism in all that they do each day. You can often find our principals supporting our students and staff in many ways, from being an academic or social emotional go-to person for our kids, to dyeing their hair various bright colors after students meet or exceed their reading goals, for example. I know You all have a couple of folks in mind when I say brightly colored dyed hair. You might find a principal in the hot seat, getting soaked in a dunk tank, or begrudgingly wearing the University of Michigan gear when they're actually really huge fans of MSU. Did you know that these fun bargains are a major incentive for our kids to knock their reading minutes out of the park? They really are. That's what gets the kids motivated. It's all in fun, and it's all meant to keep our students and staff engaged. Our principals take ownership in creating learning environments in which students feel safe, connected, challenged, and cared for. They welcome parental involvement, and they're super enthusiastic about their PTAs and PTSAs, which provide so much for their schools. This year, in particular, our principals have guided their staff through the establishment and implementation of our professional learning communities within their buildings. This work does not happen on its own. Strong leadership is key in this endeavor. Our schools are on their way to creating and fine-tuning ways to elevate student success, and we thank our principals for their dedication to this worthy effort. Each year, our district designates an official week to recognize our principals. Tonight, we are kicking off LPS Principals Week with a special resolution that will be read into the record and voted upon by the board. And joining us tonight, I would like to welcome Mr. Ben Hillard to join me at the podium. Ben is the district's assessment coordinator and also co-president of the LEADS organization, which is the educational administrators group to which all of our principals belong. So welcome, Ben. And at this time, if I can also invite trustee Dan Centers to join us at the podium. Mr. Centers will read the resolution we have prepared for this special recognition. Is this copy okay?
You're great.
Yeah, okay.
Principals Week resolution. Whereas Principals Week is dedicated to recognizing the significant contributions of Livonia Public Schools principals and the commitment to providing quality educational services, experiences, and guidance for their students. And whereas energetic and inspiring school leadership is essential if schools, teachers, and support staff are to implement college and career-ready standards and assessments, and whereas school principals play a vital role in the success of students and act as a liaison between the school and the community it serves. And whereas we join with educators, parents, and students to raise awareness of the importance of educational leadership. Now, therefore, be it resolved, the trustees of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education recognize the week of February 27th, 2023 as School Principals Week and encourage all citizens to thank and support the efforts of principals in our community.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the principals in the Livonia Educational Administrators Group, I'd like to extend a huge thank you for all the support, not just through this week, but that you've given our principals in the buildings and all the administrators in the district. It's, it's definitely noticed, and the relationship that our group has with the board and with Superintendent Oquist and the cabinet is, we feel so good about it. To continue with what Stacy said on the principals, when our principals were in their admin classes and getting their cert, it would never prepare you. Education's always evolving, so you'll never be prepared for what's to come, but you just hope that you have the right people in the right places to take on the challenges. And we've had a lot of things that no one could have prepared for or planned over the years, and I think we've had the right people in the right places at the buildings, and it's been wonderful in the way they lean on each other and work together. So I just want to echo with what Stacey said. We have a great group of principals, and so thankful that they're being honored, and thank you for your support all through the year.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there comment or questions from the board? Mrs. Burton?
I'd just like to thank again
the principals that serve in our buildings. Having kids that spanned over an 8-year period. I've had kids in and out of many buildings over many, many years. And the one thing that strikes me is the fact that the principals really do set the tone in that building. And different age groups really need kind of a different tone at times. Yeah, you can't exchange an elementary and middle school and high school principals always with a lot of fluidity. When you can do that, it's a really special and unique individual. But it's so important that that tone of not only welcoming to students and parents, but a very professional atmosphere for all that are entering in and working and growing in that building. But it is so telling. As I remember being a new parent in buildings each time, and you can sense the tone in the building with just 1 or 2 visits, and that's largely set by the principal. But I'd like to thank our building administrators for doing that, for setting that professional and yet welcoming and caring atmosphere. It's not an easy line to walk, but it's very appreciated.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other comments, questions? Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. We love this opportunity to recognize our leaders and all of our leaders across the district. As part of our administrative leadership team, we not only have our principals, we have our academic services and student services coordinators, our athletic administrators. We have leaders in many, many departments across our district as well as our schools. And the roles that they play are varied and vast. And I will tell you, it's a different role than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We expect a great deal, and we receive so much from our leaders, both in their role of growing their staff as instructional leaders, caring for the students in their charge, building relationships with the community. The role is, again, ever-changing and varied, and we have the most tremendous leaders that rise to that challenge each and every day. We are so fortunate in Livonia Public Schools. So thank you, Ben, for being here on behalf of all of our leaders. We are so proud to work with you as a team each and every day.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Other comments or questions? You know, I think Mrs. Burton hit it right on the head that you can feel when you walk into a building the atmosphere. And I think it really takes a special person, a special leader that can separate out the disciplinarian and the friend of the students. And you can feel that when you walk into the buildings. We have very, very special people in those roles. And as she said, you can feel that the minute you walk in. You know if you've got a leader in that building, and we do. And we appreciate everything they do for us day in and day out. So thank you, thank you. If there are no other comments or questions, we have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And would you take the roll, Mrs. Bonifield?
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
We will then move on to item 3B, our district update from the superintendent, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. We are going to put that up on the screen and share some highlights with you this evening. You can be clicking through for us? Okay, wonderful. So we have a lot of learning and growing that continues to happen. You see here first on the screen, we have some of our Coolidge students preparing for March's Reading Month. As you know, this is a big time in our elementary schools, and they are often theme-oriented. And so at Coolidge, we have a camp theme, and we have students creating log cabin panels, getting ready to set up their rooms in the school for the great reading that will be happening this month. And I know many of us are looking forward to our visits out to the schools to read to our students. We have our Buchanan Elementary first graders. We're learning through their library classes how to scan QR codes to access their books. Technology and learning always go hand in hand. We have an opportunity to see our students at the Livonia Career Technical Center working in our fashion merchandising. They design and create their fashions. They also study marketing and business, and in just a few months, they will be putting on an amazing fashion show to culminate all of their learning over the year. If you have a chance to attend that, it will be a treat. And we celebrated the 100th day of school last Thursday, and we had students all across the district. We have some pictured here from Johnson and Frost, who celebrated the 100th day of school, and I was so excited to be part of the celebration over at Frost with our students there. It was a great afternoon. But we had those celebrations going on. You'll see some more kindergartners at Randolph counting out their snacks. Can you imagine being allowed to have 100 snacks? Probably not as monumental if it's 100 Cheerios, but nevertheless, kids brought in projects and collections of 100 things, and it really does help them to quantify how long we have been learning and growing in school. We've had a wonderful opportunity throughout this month to celebrate Black history in many, many ways across the curriculum and across our grade levels, and we wanted to highlight just a couple here for you. You would be so impressed to see what some of our Holmes Hawks did as they worked on these collaborative posters. So they each created a square of their own and then assembled the posters together to create a group project, learning about each of these important individuals and how they've contributed to our society. Really some amazing compilations, and the study that they did and the work that they did together then to bring these and display them throughout the school. We have some of our students here at Webster who displayed their research on prominent African Americans as part of their Black History Month celebration. So they wrote newspaper articles and shared different projects and were able to present that to their classmates. And we have a number of our Garfield students in the next several pictures. They are experiencing just a wide variety of learning, enrichment, life skills, social interaction, in addition to their curricular pursuits. And you see them in a wide variety of learning throughout their day. And that has really continued to grow over the course of this year. And the opportunities that our students have at Garfield to continue to expand their experiences has really been impressive and tremendous. And speaking of additional opportunities, we have some new clubs that have been created this year. Churchill has created a Tea and Titles book club. And Churchill snow lovers have the opportunity to be part of their ski and snowboard club. Recently, our Stevenson Quiz Bowl ended the season 10-2, and they are, along with those at our other schools as well, a very, very hardworking group. We have our Franklin players who are getting ready the weekend of the 16th through the 18th, I believe, getting ready with their set for Little Mermaid. If you haven't had a chance to get your tickets, you can hop online and get those. And then Stevenson has started a new Arab American club. So lots of different opportunities. You know, we've had anything from equestrian clubs to grilled cheese clubs, and we have these to add to the mix as well. And it really does help our students to be connected to each other and to be connected to their school community. So I want to congratulate them for jumping in and finding something that they love, and also to our staff for providing these opportunities for them. Winter sports are beginning to head into playoffs. We've had an exciting couple of weeks, so a huge congratulations to Churchill boys swim team. They had a first place finish in the 200-meter medley relay at the recent KLAA conference meet. And congratulations to Josh Werbert for taking first place in the 100-meter fly, and he also set a new school record. Our Franklin Palm strikes again. You might remember they were state champs last year in Division I. They came in just in second place this year. They had a tremendous showing as the state runner-up. So congratulations to Franklin High School Pompon, who once again did a tremendous job. So our Lady Patriots continue to work hard and shine. And we've got a number of things happening this week. We have a lot of teams headed into regionals. So we have our Livonia Red Gymnastics, Izzy Broom, who took first place in Division II on floor and beam. And you might remember this name, Morgan Ruffing. She was here last year as a state champ all around state champ in Division I. She got first place on floor, beam, and all around at the conference finals. They head this weekend to their tournament at Plymouth High School on Saturday, so I am hoping we'll see them back at the podium this year. We have 5 wrestlers from Franklin who are moving on and headed to states this weekend. And bowlers, the bowling team from Churchill, first time they'll have an appearance at states, and we have individual bowlers from Franklin as well. Franklin boys basketball took the East Division Championship in districts this past weekend in a very close and exciting game on Saturday, and they are headed to, I know, Northville, and now I've forgotten, I think they play Canton, thank you. Canton on Thursday evening for the regional, or for districts. And then Stevenson and Churchill are both still in the hunt. They will both play Wednesday evening in their regional finals. So we may have missed a couple in there, but we've got a lot happening and a lot of continued success from our student athletes and our coaches. And it was really nice. Each of our schools had an opportunity to thank our KLAA officials. As you know, that can at times be a thankless job. And that has been a hard role to fill over the past couple of years, especially since the pandemic. And so Churchill recognized the officials at a basketball game recently, and I know Franklin did as well. And so we just appreciate their recognizing the work that the officials do so that our student athletes can have these experiences. And kudos to Kappa, had a wonderful production this past weekend of She Loves Me. They had a number of shows and once again wowed their audiences with such talent. We're so proud of the work that they continue to do. We had PTA Founders Day. That seems like a while ago, doesn't it? And I think that might have only been a little over a week ago, a couple weeks perhaps. But Founders Day is PTA's annual event where they really celebrate the coming together and the founding of PTA. And Livonia has long had one of the largest and strongest PTSAs in the state of Michigan. And so it was a great opportunity. We had the state president of the Michigan PTA here with us, and we had recognition of many parents, many staff, and it really was a tremendous opportunity to celebrate individuals who give selflessly each and every day at our schools to make them the places that they are. And we had a huge congratulations to Gavin Bullock, who was named a National Merit Scholarship Award finalist for his score recently on the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. So congratulations to Gavin. I think there are more to come from our other schools as well. So mark your calendars. We've got a few things coming up. We'll run through these. The first one is very, very important. It's this Wednesday, March 1st. We are holding a night designed specifically for our parents and our parents' ability to support their students' social emotional well-being, their mental health. We have our student assistance providers from all of our middle schools and high schools have truly put together a remarkable evening. There are multiple breakout sessions, and parents will be able to first come together in the PAC at Stevenson at 6 p.m., and then after about 10 minutes, they'll get some instruction and head out to 2 different breakout sessions that will be about 25 minutes each, focusing on anything from social media in your teen to anxiety and depression, to just a wide variety of mental health, social, emotional supports, and how parents can just do that important job that they have, the most important job of raising their children and supporting their social, emotional health. And again, thank you to each one of our providers who have worked tirelessly to bring this together. There'll also be about 20 resource providers from the area who will have information for parents that they can make a connection if they are looking for some supports, or simply take some very helpful information with them. So we hope you'll join us on Wednesday at Stevenson from 6 to 8. And I think I mentioned Franklin Players will be presenting The Little Mermaid, always a favorite, from set design to costumes to on stage and behind stage. They have been working so hard. So March 16th through the 19th, 5 performances, is that right? Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive. So look for that. And a reminder, kindergarten registration is on. We have hundreds of students already registered. If your family has a kindergartner coming up, please be sure to get to the registration site and let us know you are headed our way to become part of the class of 2036.
That's crazy.
Thank you so much, President Johnson, for letting us share some points of pride from across the district.
Thank you, Superintendent Oquist. Any questions or comments from the board?
Busy, busy.
Busy, yes. All right, we'll move on to item 3C, written communications. I do not have any written communications in the board. Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3D, response to prior audience communication. I do not have any response. So we'll move on to item E, audience communication. Audience communication is the time during our meetings where we set aside some time for the board to listen to the community, any thoughts they may have on any of the issues, other things going on in the community. A couple of things to keep in mind is what is the role of the board? And that is, number one, to set district policy. Second of all, we hire and evaluate the superintendent, and then we align the funding priorities to the district's goals. Those are the areas that the board is involved in. So anyone coming before the board who may have an issue within those 3 items, and if you want some response from us, that would come from the board. Anything else that might come before the board, we talk about being day-to-day activities or day-to-day operations. If your questions or issues has anything to do with those, then you would, and you want a response, that would come from the administration. So the other thing that we keep in mind is we give each speaker 3 minutes, and we have a little timer, so you'll hear a beep. Mrs. Bradford will do that. We find that doing that with a little beep is a little less intrusive than saying, "You're done." So when you hear that, just wrap up your comments and let the next speaker go forward. So I do have 2 blue slips, and Emily, I'm going to butcher your middle name. Is it Chor? Chores. Emily Chores Fielder. How are you tonight, Emily?
Very well, President Johnson. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. As President Johnson mentioned, my name is Emily Chorsfielder, and I am the program supervisor at Greenmead Historical Park. Tonight, I would like to share with you a wonderful field trip opportunity we have for second grade classes to step back in time to the 1910s. If you have not visited Greenmead, we have many historic structures from Livonia Township dating from 1829 to 1937, including a restored one-room schoolhouse. The Newburgh School is available for teachers to use to help their students experience changes in their community over time in alignment with Grade 2 history standards. This year, we are happy to announce a partnership with the Livonia Historical Society that provides a $350 grant to cover the costs of the schoolhouse experience, a tour of the Newburgh intersection buildings, and the costs of in-house transportation for all second grade classes within Livonia Public Schools. This spring, we are looking forward to welcoming 4 classes from Grant, 1 class from Randolph, 4 classes from Kennedy, and 4 classes from Buchanan. And we have the opportunity to welcome other classes as well if there are interest and it works out in their schedule. It is our hope that with the support of community members and organizations, we will be able to continue to offer this no-cost field trip opportunity for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Jim McConnell. Good evening, Mr. McConnell. Thank you for being here.
Good evening.
Oh,
Just, is it green?
there.
I have bad vision. Thank you for taking a few minutes to listen to me. You got a little pamphlet on the Livonia Historical Society, and you are aware that we suffered the damages of COVID like everybody else did. There was an 8-member board when COVID began. A couple of them are dead. A couple of them moved out of town. A couple of them have gone to nursing homes. And there was one guy left, Bob Legal, 93 years old, president. He got a group together, and I was one of the individuals who volunteered to attend his meeting. I was the last person in the room when he turned out the lights, and therefore I became the president of the society. And it's it's an honor, and yet we're trying to rebuild an organization. So we were extremely pleased when Bill Joyner came up and said, "Hey, Jim, how much money do you need for that field trip idea?" And I said, "Well, $7,000. Oh, I can do that." So the Hardy Family Trust gave us $5,000. And Emily has been wonderful to work with, and Jen Corey on the elementary education staff here. A group of us sat down, and that came together. And I'm really pleased to have that happening. And so Greenmead has got this experience now for all your second graders, and I'm going to move on into the 3-minute time limit to the Bentley Marker Project. As I told you, the society was gone with COVID. And so we took over, and we were driving out to Greenmead for a board meeting. We suckered in a few other individuals. And going by Bicentennial Park, I thought, oh, there's a Michigan historical marker there for the American Revolutionary War soldiers that ended up in Livonia. And I thought, I remember 20 years ago there were some people talking about doing that project for Bentley High School. So we turned out a call for alumni to come. 3 guys came. I thought I'd get some, 75 to 80, 85 alums that would be young and all this. First guy was class of 1953. The other 2 were 1955. I mean, I thought, oh my God, they're older than I am. What am I doing here? We tried again. We got a bigger meeting, got a bigger group, and Joyner came up and said, I got some money for you again. And so we began planning. We are now working very closely with the Stacy here, and she has pulled some boxes up out of the archives. We have to document everything exactly by a primary source document to apply to the state of Michigan. The cost is nearly $5,000 for the marker and a little plaque, and it costs another $1,000 for a ceremony. So we need about $6,000. So we're working on that as well. But the research is the key. With the help from this school district, we've already made great progress. I contacted Page Plant at the library. They have material. Emily has 4 folders of material at Greenmead's, and then I called the clerk, Susan Nash, for her assistance, because we need to document what the elections were in 1944 when this was all coming together, 1946, the bond issue, all that. So we've got all this coming together. Our goal is to submit the application by the 1st of April, and as you know, when you were talking about process time sometimes taking a little while, it's going to take us over a year, and there goes my timer. Thank you. So we're looking at, in June, we hope, of 2024 dedicating that marker. And that is, of course, 1 year before, and this is my close, the city celebrates, and Susan Nash was helpful in this one also, the clerk. June 23rd, 1950, I'm a history guy, the city was founded. That means that in 2025, we will be 75 years old. The society is already beginning to make plans to help the school district observe the city's 75th anniversary. So put that on your agenda for 2 years from now and help us get the money for the Bentley marker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell.
Thank you.
All right, we will now move on to.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Very much. We appreciate it. My kids are Stevenson grads, and they love the school, and I love the education they got. I taught in Dearborn, and I always admired what this board did. And
We
working
appreciate
with
it.
Dearborn and other folks. So it's nice to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to item 4, our consent agenda. Are there any items on the consent agenda that any board members would like to be removed? Seeing none, can I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the special meeting of January 30th, 2023. 5B, minutes of the regular meeting of January 30th, 2023.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Are there any questions, comments? Seeing none, we have a motion to accept the consent agenda. Mrs. Bonnefield would take the roll, please.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Sorry. I got my S's and my N's mixed up. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6A, purchase of LMC furniture. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation from the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, and approve the Phase 2 purchase of furniture for library media centers at Cleveland Elementary, Rosedale Elementary, Riley Upper Elementary, Frost Middle School, and Franklin High School from NBS Commercial Interiors in Troy, Michigan, in an amount not to exceed $926,000.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and we'll hear from Mr. Francis. Good evening.
Good evening, President Johnson. This is a planned purchase out of the 2021 bond fund. We've discussed this on a couple previous occasions, as the board knows, and this is the purchase of the furniture for the library media centers in this coming summer's Phase 2 renovations. This is the furniture minus the bookshelves, as we discussed, because we brought those to the board a handful of months back because of anticipated longer lead times. So this is a very similar purchase from about a year ago, a little less than that we did similarly for the 2022 summer Phase 1 renovation. So this would include things such as soft seating, chairs, tables, etc. All those types, high tops and regular tables on casters, etc. So we'll be going into this summer Cleveland and Rosedale Elementaries, Riley Upper Elementary, and Franklin High School and Frost Middle School doing those renovations, completely renovating and reimagining those libraries. And this purchase, with a not to exceed $926,000, is going to provide the furniture for those projects.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Any comments or questions from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, to approve the purchase of LMC furniture out of the 2021 bond. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6B, purchase of scoreboards for high school baseball, softball fields. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase and installation of athletic field improvements in the form of scoreboards at the baseball and softball fields at Churchill High School, Franklin High School, and Stevenson High School in the amount of $145,000, which includes contingency, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contracts with the recommended contractors.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton. And we'll hear again from Mr. Francis.
Thank you again. Over the past 6 to 7 years, as the board knows, we've worked on our 3 high schools' athletic fields, doing a variety of projects and improvements across multiple sports. This is just one piece of that as we continue to move forward, and it has to do with the replacing of scoreboards at the 3 high schools, both softball and baseball fields. So the vendor here, the recommended vendor, has Daktronics, which is a sign that we are familiar with in the district. It is well reputable. We've had good success with it. And it also includes the installation of those 6 signs at those 6 fields. For that $145,000 has the contingency really for not necessarily the purchase of the board, but for installation. Whenever you're going in and installing something, you never know what's going to happen when you start digging into the ground. So we do have a little bit of contingency in there to protect the district during this project. So we're excited for this. The athletic administrators, the principals and administrative teams, and coaches at the 3 high schools are excited for this, and they're really going to be an upgrade for the schools. They're pretty special. We've started working with the company on some renderings of what the boards would look like, and the namings and the logos and whatnot. And boy, if they look half as good in real life as the renderings do, they're dynamite. And this is going to be a general fund purchase for these boards.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Questions or
welcome.
comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
Mr. Francis, I think we discussed this during the committee of the whole, but can you remind me when we are expecting installation to be completed?
We would believe that this would be, really, it's going to start bleeding into the summer now. So the spring season is obviously baseball, softball, so we'll be looking to have this worked on over the summer to be ready to go for the next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton, to approve the purchase of scoreboards for high school baseball, softball fields. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 6C, purchase of vehicles for LCTC. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford?
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of a vehicle for the LCTC Construction Trades Program for a cost not to exceed $81,000 as allowed through the 61C grant.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Acosta, and we'll hear from Mr. Etu.
I'm tucked over here.
There you are.
Thank you, President Johnson. Yes, this is for a large vehicle purchase for the LCTC, or Livonia Career Technical Center Construction Trades Program. It's for a cost not to exceed $81,000 through our 61C Vocational Equipment Grant. This vehicle, an F550 or F600, depending on the quotes that we receive, and we have received multiple quotes, will be used for hauling construction trades equipment, including the most recently purchased spray trailer to and from approved construction sites. It's a vehicle that will be used by our teacher for this purpose, and we're asking for that approval.
Thank you, Mr. Etu. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton?
And again, this, Mr. Etu, this is a grant that was applied for specifically by Rick Martin for this equipment. And if I understand correctly, that this cannot be used for other purposes, even within that program. It must be used for equipment specifically.
Used for hauling equipment to and from approved construction sites, correct.
Okay, great. Alrighty. And thank you again to Mr. Martin. We heard from him at our last meeting, but thank you again to Mr. Martin and others in our district that really go above and beyond to seek out alternative funding and therefore add-ons for our program that make it really special. So thank you very much to Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions or comments? One question I have, Mr. Etu, and I don't think we brought it up at the committee of the whole. Is this a gas or diesel?
At this time, I believe it's a diesel. I'm not positive, though. I can look into that for you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's not a rush. Thanks.
Mhm.
All right, seeing no other comments, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Acosta, to approve the purchase of vehicles for the LCTC. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 7, our instruction matters, and 7A is limited out-of-district schools of choice for 2023-2024. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent to participate in limited out-of-district schools of choice under sections 105 and 105C for the 2023-2024 school year. Openings to include no more than 185 seats in kindergarten through 6th grade.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And we're going to hear from Mr. Green.
I'll
Good
come
evening,
over
Mr.
here as
Green.
well. Good evening.
You didn't hide as well as Mr. Eaton.
Not as well. Usually it's a good spot. Good evening. Thank you to the Board of Education for your time and questions at the study session this month and at our Committee of the Whole meeting on February 13th regarding limited schools of choice for the 23-24 school year. As you know, Livonia Public Schools has offered limited schools of choice since the 2014-15 school year, and since that time, limited schools of choice has brought in additional revenue to the district during an era of declining enrollment. In addition to the additional revenue, these school choice placements have helped balance class size and fill gaps at various locations throughout our schools without negatively impacting class size. In addition, strategic placement of schools of choice students helps to reduce the possibility of kindergarten overflow and combination classrooms. As such, and per our previous discussions, we again are recommending to the Board of Education to offer up 185 total seats through the 105 and 105C Limited Schools of Choice program for grades kindergarten through 6th for the 23-24 school year. If the Board of Education approves this recommendation for next year, the application window for limited schools of choice would be from March 1st, 2023 to March 31st, 2023 at 4 p.m. It's an online registration process. On April 14th, 2023, there would be a publicly recorded lottery that would take place as needed for certain grade levels. These timelines, upon approval, would be published on our website starting tomorrow. And as a reminder, Niji, Eero, and Webster would conduct separate limited schools of choice windows as they have done in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Questions or comments from the board? Mr. Green, can you remind us, you said this program started in 2014.
That is correct.
What grades have we accepted during those periods of time?
We started with the younger grades, and we've gone all the way up through 8th grade at times, and have offered seats for our CAP and Global Ed programs historically.
Okay, and the recommendation here is 185 kindergarten through 6th.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Any comments, questions? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Bonifield, to, I'm sorry, Mrs. Bradford, there's too many Bs.
There's a lot of us.
To approve the limited out-of-district schools of choice for 2023-2024. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 7B, expulsion of secondary students. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District expel 2 secondary students for violations of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education policies.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers, for the expulsion of secondary students. Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Did I do it upside down? again?
Don't worry.
What did I do?
Mrs. Burton.
Mrs. Burton had, sorry.
Mrs. Burton says yes.
Sorry, okay. I'll fix it.
It's okay.
Okay, so we've got Mrs. Bradford and Mrs. Burton say yes. Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes.
I
motion-
apologize for that.
That's all right.
Catch people off guard.
Again, there's too many Bs. That takes us to item 8, our personnel matters, and item 8A is teachers for approval. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Acosta.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and offer employment for the 2022-23 school year to the teachers listed on the attached document.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And are we going to hear from Mr. Abate?
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. So the new staff members we are presenting to the board this evening have been selected to fill a variety of roles, particularly occupational and physical therapy positions. They are well qualified to fill these positions and have been fully vetted through our interview process. We are confident they will perform at a high level and represent Livonia Public Schools in a manner that is consistent with our shared vision and collective commitments. These positions have also been included in the 2022-2023 budget. We're pleased to be recommending these talented professionals to join our LPS family, and with your approval, we are excited to have them working with our students.
Thank you, Mr. Abate. Questions or comments from the board?
Yes, welcome.
Yes, welcome, thank you. We have a motion by Mrs. Acosta, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, and to approve teachers for approval. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes. That motion carries. That takes us to item 8B, teachers for tenure. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Get a little bit bigger. There we go. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District amend the tenure motion that was approved at the January 30, 2023 regular board meeting to reflect the correct tenure effective date of November 22, 2021 for Kelly Billen, thereby accepting the recommendation of the superintendent and acknowledging that tenure status has been granted to the following teachers effective on the respective dates. Kelly Billen, November 22, 2021. Allison Boyd, January 26, 2023. Brittany Cornelier, January 10, 2023. Gillian Drutchess, January 29, 2023. Aaron Horback, January 29, 2023.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And are we going to hear from Mrs. Keats?
Yes, you
Good
are.
evening.
Good evening. So tonight we had a date correction on the tenure list we brought to our previous regular meeting. Again, we wish to offer congratulations to these staff members for achieving tenure, and we look forward to their continued success in LPS.
Thank you, Mrs. Keats. Questions or comments from the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Congratulations.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford, to approve the teachers for tenure. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 8C, teachers for recall. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education accept the recommendation of the superintendent and recall to district employment as a teacher for the 2022-23 school year the person listed on the attached document dated February 27th, 2023.
Support.
I heard Mrs. Bonnefield, probably because she's sitting right next to me. So we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, for the teachers for recall. And again, is it Mrs. Keats or?
It would be me this
Mr.
time,
Abate?
Mr. Johnson.
You're playing back and forth.
Yes.
Thank you.
Quite simply, we had a mid-year retirement, which created a vacancy for which we offered recall to one of our teachers on layoff. The recall actually was declined by our former teacher, and so we have moved on with the hiring process to fill that vacancy, which will be filled shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Abate. Any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none,
Mr.
we have.
Johnson?
Mrs. Burton.
Mr. Abate, just, I'm sorry, it's a clarification because I noticed the same thing. This is just basically a formality, bringing before the board that this person was offered the position but declined it, so they will no longer be on the layoff list.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, to accept the teacher for recall. And Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 8D, resignations, and this does not require a motion. This is for board information only. So it takes us to item 8E, retirements. And may I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for services rendered by Jennifer Abler, Jennifer Johns, Linda Melcher.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Burton. And is it Mrs. Keats?
It is. It feels
is.
fitting that someone named Jennifer would read this resolution. So tonight we honor and congratulate 3 members of our LPS family who are retiring from their positions with Livonia Public Schools. As these staff members leave the district, they take with them a combined total of 78 years of experience. On behalf of the administration, I would like to thank these wonderful staff members for the dedicated years of service they have provided the students of LPS. And we ask the board to please adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for our retirees.
Thank you, Mrs. Keats. Questions or comments from the board? I see-
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you. You know, this is one of those ones, when you look at the years of service of these people, it's so hard to accept these retirements because of the years of experience that they have. But it becomes inevitable at times that people retire, and we just wish you the best in the next chapter of your life, and wish you good luck. So thank you. All right, then that takes us to item 9, hearing from board members. Oh, we need to vote, don't we? Mrs. Bonnefield.
You're
would you
just
take the
making
vote?
me feel better because I made a mistake. Taking pity on me. Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. Now it moves us to item 9, hearing from board members, and item A is second reading of Board Bylaw BBABA, duties of the president. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Bylaw BBABA, duties of the president.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. And I think Mrs. Oquist is going to help us with that.
Yes, President Johnson, thank you. Yes. The duties of the president was recently, bylaws for that BBABA was recently updated to include the following phrase, that the president of the board shall have the option to make and second motions, shall vote on all agenda items unless a conflict of interest exists. While that has been the practice of our president of the Board of Education, we have now codified that as part of the duties of the president. This is the second reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Any questions, comments from the board? Seeing none. Again, we appreciate all the work that was put into the revision of these policies. I know it's not an easy task, and we certainly do appreciate it. So we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, that motion carries. Thank you. That takes us to item 9B, second reading of Board Policy JI, Pledge of Allegiance. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy JI, Pledge of Allegiance.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Acosta. And again, we will turn to Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson. Board Policy JI is a newly created policy. Our board had an opportunity to discuss this at a recent study session and committee of the whole meeting. This policy really, again, just puts as part of our formal board policies a section of the revised code which talks about the opportunity for our students to have the opportunity each day to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and that a student will not be compelled against the student's objection or the objection of the student's parent or legal guardian to recite the pledge, and they will not be subject to any penalty or retaliation at school for not reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. This verbiage comes almost directly from the revised school code, and the board was desirous of assuring that we had it as part of our formal board policy. This has certainly been a long-standing practice within the district, and we collect that information each year as to how students have that opportunity at each of our schools, but we now have a policy, so if folks do have questions about that or whether or not that is a practice in the school district, they can be referred to our new board policy, JI. Again, not a new practice, simply a new policy.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion to accept the second reading of Board Policy JI, Pledge of Allegiance, moved by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Acosta. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Acosta.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, that motion carries. Once again, thank you for all the work. We continually go through our board policies and update them, and it is a monumental task. If you've ever seen our two binders, you'd get a flavor for how much work is involved, so we do greatly appreciate it. Thank you. That takes us to item 9C, hearing from board members, and as our custom, I will open it up to Mrs. Bonnefield, almost hit me in the face, to comment. So I'll start off with Mrs. Bonnefield.
Thank you, President Johnson. I was so happy today at the end of the school day today. My fellow Rotarians and I from the Livonia AM Club were able to meet at Churchill High School. We were able to meet with our interactors, which is our high school Rotarian group. We had a great turnout. I think there's about 30 people there. Being during the day, we had a lot of club members there. The students were there. Mrs. Casada, Principal Casada, gave a short talk about leadership. And we had a really great time. And while we were sitting here, Ivana, I think from the president of the group, sent me a text that said, hey, I want to thank you. It was so great. It was so nice. And we love our Interact group. It's been going strong. They do a lot of stuff. One of which is the Touch a Truck, which a lot of people will recognize and have gone to in July, and they're just a great group of students. We appreciate them very much. We had a great time, and we're going to put it on the books to make sure we have a combined meeting at least once a year. So I just wanted to say thank you and just report out that we had just a fantastic time. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Other questions or comments? Mr. Centers. Take your time.
If I could give Mr. Centers a second, and I'm going to just tag along to Mrs. Bonnefield for a second.
Sure.
Just for those who may not be aware, the Interact Club is the Rotaries reaching down to the high school level, and in one other way, encouraging that volunteerism at the high school level, which is really exciting. Churchill High School, among all of our three, the Churchill High School's canned food drive strikes me as one that that building has historically had such a level of volunteerism and generosity, which is really exciting. But the Interact Club specifically is Rotary's version of encouraging that volunteerism and that leadership with the high school generation, which is really exciting.
They're a strong group. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Burton is one of our
He is. He's involved in Rotary
advisors.
also.
He's one of our advisors, and he's in the AM Club and helps us out with the interactors.
Yes.
Before Mr. Senator goes, the other thing that we didn't talk about was we had a great conference this weekend.
Yes.
That's true.
I forget how exhausting they are, and I got very zoomed out this weekend. But great classes, great networking. It was just a lot of fun. And Mrs. Acosta, Mrs. Jarvis, I saw you there. I saw Mr. Johnson.
Not me.
Mrs. Burton,
I
did
was
you
not
make
able
it
to
on?
attend this
No.
weekend. No.
We had too many baby things
I
to
did.
do.
Yes.
So,
We had a lot of
but
things
it was a fantastic weekend. We learned a ton. The classes were great, and so kudos to us for going and getting some more education. So.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. You ready, Mr. Centers?
Yes. Nearly 9 years ago, I experienced one of the greatest honors of my life when I was appointed to the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education. Since that time, the Livonia and Westland communities have put their faith in me by electing me 3 times to the school board. Livonia Public Schools is an amazing part of our community, molding students into critical thinkers and leaders who graduate and make an amazing impact on our world. So it is with mixed emotions that I announce this evening that I'm stepping down from the Board of Education effective Sunday, March 5th, 2023. In my eyes, being a good board member means much more than showing up to meetings. Good board members are present and engaged with students, staff, and stakeholders. Recent circumstances have made it very difficult for me to be engaged in that meaningful way. As a former classroom teacher, and now former board member, I know firsthand all the challenges that our educators face on a daily basis. I am enormously proud of the work our teachers and staff do to change the lives of our students. Additionally, the LPS Board of Education has consistently been a model school board in our state, recognized statewide for excellence. It has been a pleasure to learn from every one of the members that I've served with throughout the years. Additionally, Livonia Public Schools has been blessed with outstanding administrative leadership. Randy Leopa and Andrea Oquist are transformative public servants. They built tremendous cabinet teams that have provided outstanding opportunities for LPS students. The remaining members of the Livonia Board of Education now have an opportunity to appoint a new board member to serve out the remainder of my term. I have full faith that they will select someone who will love and embrace the role of board member in the way that I have in recent years. Livonia Public Schools and the students we serve are in good hands. Thank you for the privilege and opportunity to serve. That's all.
Well, anybody have anything to say after that? Mrs. Burton.
I've thought about this over the last couple of days, Dan, since you reached out, and I know you reached out to each one of us to let us know that this would be announced tonight. I respect very much the reason why being an effective board member does take an enormous amount of time. Not only being at and preparing for meetings, but as you cited, Dan, to be very involved in our community and in our schools. It takes many, many hours to do that well. At some times of our lives, that falls very naturally because we have children in the schools and we're there 5 days a week. And at some times of our lives, it does not fall as naturally and it requires much greater effort. But it does require an enormous amount of time. You are very correct about that. And I am sad to see you go, but I respect very much that reason. Most boards have a number of people that sit on them, and that's very deliberate because each one of us brings something very unique to this table. You have brought a very, very important contribution to this Board of Education on top of being a former educator and a solid thinker. Your day-to-day life in Lansing has brought enormous benefit to this Board of Education. You have kept us very informed about what's going on, and as importantly, when it's important to take action and when it's important to sit back, because that's good to know. We need to know when we need to reach out, and we need to know when to sit back because the gears are moving. But you have kept our board very, very informed. We are a better board for your sitting at this table with us. If your circumstances change in life, speaking for myself, I would be honored to sit at the table with you again, as I told you this weekend. Thank you very, very much for your board service, and I know you're going to continue to serve our community.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Mrs. Bradford.
Yeah, that was very eloquently said. I agree with Colleen wholeheartedly in everything she said, and we just want to wish you the best of luck. We are going to miss you, and you have been a great contributor to this board. I'm proud of the board that we serve on, and we were going to miss you tremendously, but we do understand and appreciate and respect why you're doing what you need to do. So thank you for allowing us to have the pleasure of you sitting on our board, and you will be missed.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Benefield.
And thank you, Dan. Again, Colleen is very eloquent, but we know that you will continue to lead the charge to make sure our public education kids get all what they need to be able to have the best education that they can, and that we'll miss you.
Mrs. Jarvis.
We're just going down the road.
Go down the road.
Torturing me.
So when you were appointed for this position, you may recall that I was also running for that appointment. And it came down to you and me for the last two. And they chose you. And I remember thinking, he must be one hell of a guy. And they were right, you are. And we're certainly going to miss you. You put your heart and soul into this. And I think that you're in a position now where that's not possible for you to do. And you can't, in good conscience, do this job without being able to put your whole heart and soul into it. So I respect your choice. But I do agree that if it comes to the point where you can put your whole heart and soul in it, that you consider coming back to this table.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Costa.
First, I just wanted to thank you for welcoming me on the board with open arms, and I appreciate that. And I commend you for always putting our community first, including in making this tough decision. We wish you all the best.
Thank you. Mrs. Oquist.
So I'll just keep it brief, and we've talked a lot.
Thank you, Mrs.
And
Oquist. Oh, you didn't mean that brief. I'm sorry.
Not quite that brief. You are an educator at heart, and you are a community servant at front of mind. And I'm so proud to call you a friend and colleague. Thank you for all that you've given to us.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. I guess that leaves me. You know, Dan, I was almost taken aback when you said 9 years ago, because it's really hard to believe it's been 9 years. You have brought, as Mrs. Burton said, a unique perspective to the board. You have really grown in that role, as I think we all have over those years, but it's been a privilege sitting at the table with you. you really did bring a lot to this board. Your perspectives, particularly with your other job, makes it very unique to us. And it was very, very helpful to us. As I said, it's been a privilege sitting at the table with you, and I can only wish you the best of luck in your endeavors. And again, as some of my colleagues have said, if you ever change your mind and you get the opportunity, please let us know. Thank you. Let's give it. Now, anything else before the board tonight? Seeing none, as long as there's no more business before the board tonight, we are adjourned. Thank you so much.